Hey everyone, it's Samuel.
And I'm Jay Annelli.
And welcome to Plot Hooks, the podcast where we explore the arts of narrative and collaborative storytelling in the world's premier RPG, Dungeons & Dragons.
Today in the prime material, Ravnica and Theros.
In the wilds, Niv-Mizzet, the Firemind.
And in the tavern, what would you do if you met the Wanderer?
Well, thank you very much for joining us, Jay.
You're welcome. It's good to be here.
Yeah, it's excited to talk about today's subject. Of course, for those of you out there who are not aware, Wizards of the Coast, the parent company who runs Dungeons & Dragons, also has the highly successful trading card game Magic the Gathering, which also has its own giant subset of lore. And within the last couple of years, we've seen some crossover releases between Dungeons & Dragons and Magic the Gathering with the releases of the Guildmaster's Guide to Ravnica and the Odysseys of Theros book. So we thought that it would be great to talk about these amazing settings, and what better person to do it with than with Mr. Jay Annelli. Why don't you introduce yourself, sir?
Hi, so I'm Jay Annelli. I am, most recently, I am the author of Magic the Gathering Legends, A Visual History from Abrams Comic Arts. I'm kind of living the dream as a lore fan of Magic, that I have a official Magic art book published that you can find in stores right now. It came out just a few weeks ago. But I started about 5 years ago. Magic had a big shift in its storytelling that brought a lot of new people in to a returning setting. And one of the things me and a friend noticed is there wasn't a lot out there, and there was nothing official onboarding people onto these planes. So I started writing about Magic's lore and history for newcomers. And then about 2.5 years ago now, I got contacted from Wizards of the Coast because they had some very complicated Planeswalker-heavy story stuff coming up, and they wanted someone who knew the material back and forth to act as a continuity editor. So I have been working with Wizards of the Coast for the last 2.5 years or so on various Magic stories. Oh, and I'm also a co-host of the Vorthos cast, who will murder me if I don't mention that here, which is a Magic the Gathering lore podcast.
Yes, and that is where I first started listening to y'all way back in, like, episode 12 or so, whenever I started.
Oh, God, we were rough then. Yeah, we were putting out, like, episodes 2 or 3 times a week because we didn't know any better. Yeah.
But yes, we wanted to just pick your brain on these two Magic-specific settings, which have now been adapted for Dungeons & Dragons of Ravnica and Theros. Before we get into that, though, just a couple of announcements to make before we hop right in. Remember to follow us on all our social media. You could find us at Plot Hooks on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Remember, however you listen to the podcast, to give it a quick rate and review. It helps spread the word about Plot Hooks to more people. Remember that the Oath of Destiny, a new Paladin subclass produced by Plot Hooks, went live this week on the DM's Guild. So be sure to check that out. Finally, remember to support us on Patreon. You can find lots of awesome content up there from the Plot Hooks team. And it helps us keep the lights on and keep producing more and more content for you all. But with all those announcements out of the way, let's dive into the prime material. So, I guess to start, just with a little bit of an overview of Magic's multiverse, it works a little bit different in Magic the Gathering than it does with Dungeons & Dragons, where Dungeons and Dragons has the main world called the material plane or the prime material, and then all these different planes which are surrounding it, like the plane of fire and the plane of water, and then the outer planes like the abyss and the nine hells and Mount Celestia and all these different environments, but it's like one reality. But in Magic, it's a little bit different. There's all sorts of different planes, almost like there's different sorts of prime materials, isn't there?
This always gets so confusing when talking about D&D and Magic, respectively, because they essentially invert the terms plane and realm. So for in a Magic, plane is a distinct physical reality, and realms are what you would refer to as like the plane of fire and all that stuff.
For Magic, it creates some pretty interesting settings because whenever you start creating an actual set, you're going to a specific plane, a specific world, which has its defining characteristic. Theros, which top of the mind, one of the things we'll be talking about today is ancient Greek world.
They have a central thematic through line. Usually, sometimes it's flavorful, like Theros is what's called a top-down set because it starts with, this is Greek myth world, whereas a place like Ravnica is a bottom-up set because it starts with, this is two-color world, which Magic is made up of 5 different colors that each embody different values, which is how Magic defines characterization, where D&D has the alignment chart.
And within these different realities, Ravnica and Theros are two of the ones that we've visited. In both cases, multiple times in the MTG story. And most of Magic's story, as you travel between these different planes, it follows planeswalkers, which are creatures that can travel between these different realities. And we'll talk a little bit about them as we go through the show. For Ravnica, though, starting there, you mentioned the fact that it's a bottom-up set, starting with these 10 color pairs, essentially, which morphed into 10 guilds and just built out this setting that we now know as Ravnica today. Tell us a little bit about the 10th district and everything going on there.
So the 10th district is the capital of the city plane of Ravnica. So what happened here is essentially 10,000 years ago, these 10 warring factions, each centered around this color pair. So they're each an expression of those color pairs. It's not the only way they can be interpreted, but they're, the most common, especially among Magic players. They like to identify themselves by the guild names. But these 10 factions came together to form what was called the Guild Pact, which was a magically binding document created by a planeswalker named Azor, a Sphinx planeswalker, who it brought about peace on Ravnica. And without these 10 warring factions, they became 10 guilds, each with an essential role in society. Some are more obviously essential than others, but in some cases that essential role was keep Rakdos happy so the giant demon lord doesn't come out and destroy everything. And it continued this way for about 10,000 years, and so they developed, and the city grew until it encompassed essentially the entire plane. So it's a lot like, if you're a Star Wars fan, it's a lot like Coruscant. It's that kind of thing where it's just a city that has been built on top of the rubble of earlier versions of the city that has been built on top of that rubble.
And whenever we look at the 10 different guilds, obviously this is a very brief overview of Ravnica, and we can't get into too much of the specifics, but who are the major players here outside of the 10 guilds? Or is it really just these 10 guilds that just kind of run things on the plane?
It's really just the 10 guilds. There are other organizations, but none match the reach and power of these guilds. So the top line for each is you've got the Azorius Senate, which is the legislative body for the plane. It also functions as law enforcement. You've got House Demir, which are like the couriers, the messengers, anything that communicates information, but also the spies and the assassins. Cult of Rakdos is manual labor in many cases. That was how they were originally interpreted, but that has turned into more of an entertainment theme as time goes on. So they're kind of the mad carnival. The Gruul clans are the people who reject Ravnican civilization. They're the anarchists that live in the broken sections of the city called the Rubble Belt. The Selesnyan Conclave are, they're the tree huggers. There's no better way to put that. They're the ones who care. They care about cultivation and preserving nature, but preserving nature in a world like Ravnica. So they have nice structured and orderly gardens and forests. The Orzhov Syndicate, who are basically just Wall Street. They're the bankers, and they've got a religion centered around wealth. The Golgari Swarm are the recyclers. They're the ones that use all the refuse and dead bodies drop down into their area, and they recycle all of it and reclaim everything. The Simic are the doctors, the medicine people, and also the mad scientists who like to graft crab arms onto themselves.
Yes.
Izzet League is all about the infrastructure and technology of the plane, and we'll talk about that more later with our dragon Niv-Mizzet, who was the founder of the Izzet League.
Yes.
But they're as likely to blow something up as to build something useful. And then the Boros Legion, who are the standing army of the plane, who keep the peace, are also sometimes law enforcement. And sometimes they're the boot-heeled problem children. So yeah, there are other factions. Like there are ungilded factions that don't have the same power or reach. There are like goblin gangs, goblin street crime, analogous to the Italian mafia. You have some ancient cults that are around and some other organizations, but we'll talk about that when we talk a little bit more about various plot hooks for the plane.
Sure. With all of those very powerful factions, you mentioned the Guild Pact, which really is kind of the only thing that has prevented the plane from descending just into chaos. And even with the Guild Pact, the various guilds are fighting to have the most control and the most say that they possibly can anyway. But without the Guild Pact, you could just imagine that just society would just kind of fall apart.
Yeah, so we actually saw that happen once. So in the plane's past, when we first visited the plane, it was the time when the original Guild Pact crumbled and all of the various factions started squabbling for power. And eventually the guilds started to fade away for a little while as people left them because there was nothing no longer binding them until Jace Beleren, who's one of those planeswalkers we talked about before, discovered a failsafe that Azor left behind. Azor, you might notice the Azorius Senate is named after him. He left behind a failsafe that bestowed the power of the Guild Pact on who essentially becomes a magical arbiter of law on the plane, on a living being. And for a while, that was Jace Beleren. And then an event happened where this big bad dragon from elsewhere in the multiverse, not Niv-Mizzet, but who kicked Niv-Mizzet's butt, he showed up and severed Jace's connection. And then Niv-Mizzet became the Guild Pact. And what that does, essentially, is, while the Azorius Senate writes the laws, the Guild Pact arbitrates the disputes between the guilds, and their word can be magically binding law.
This is a pretty crucial element to telling stories on Ravnica. there's lots of good opportunities for stories to be told, but this interaction between the guilds, whether you are trying to tell a story where you're a group of guildless people unaffiliated with one of the 10 guilds, or whether you're trying to tell a story where guilds are coming together to fight for a common goal, or however you're trying to tell a story, it would tend to focus around these 10 guilds in some way, shape, or form. And we've seen lots of great stories told on Ravnica, just in magic lore, which we can emulate or take hints from for telling stories in role-playing games. There's the fights of power between the guilds that we saw. I think it would be really fun to play through the race, which was the first time we went back to Ravnica.
Yeah, the implicit maze. So in order for the failsafe to be activated, the guilds had discovered this, and they all thought it was just a source of power. But essentially, it was a doomsday weapon that, in this race, and I'm using quotation fingers here because you can't see it, Azor had essentially decreed that if the guilds couldn't prove themselves able to work together, he would unleash his supreme verdict on them, which, if you've ever seen the magic card Supreme Verdict, it says destroy all creatures. So it's a spell that would have essentially leveled the 10th, which was the capital district of the plane. There are 10 districts on Ravnica, 10 numbered districts. And then beyond that, there are a lot of like named districts that are more like the suburbs. They're still urban, but they're not where you're going to see skyscrapers or anything.
That's awesome. Whenever we went back the most recent time in the Guilds of Ravnica, Ravnica Allegiance, War of the Spark trilogy, there was lots of stories of film noir and espionage variety with all the things leading up to that War of the Spark set as things were kind of falling into place and all kinds of infiltration and things happening behind the scenes, and Nicol Bolas was trying to pull strings and all sorts of just espionage stuff was happening, and that's a great story to tell in Ravnica too.
Yeah, so one of the things that was cool, especially Django Wexler's stories called The Gathering Storm, that was the lead up to War of the Spark, is that it created a kind of cold war between the guilds, and even in each guild there was a central conflict with two different points of view that were essentially warring, and you didn't know exactly where each guild was going to land in the final battle with this elder dragon from another world named Nicol Bolas.
Mm-hmm. And of course, with that, the idea of these disparate factions uniting against a common force, as had to happen in War of the Spark, as Nicol Bolas provided the appropriate inspiration for unification, I guess we could put it, is always a really interesting story to tell as well, whenever you have factions which for thousands of years are used to healthy and unhealthy competition now having to figure out a way to work together. And that can create some pretty good party dynamics too, whenever you're talking about playing characters from different guilds. That can create some really interesting story opportunities.
Yeah, Ravnica is the kind of plane where you can tell a lot of different kinds of stories. Noir, espionage, any kind of like urban fantasy. Ravnica is a really good place to tell it. You can also go as far as like eldritch horror. So on Ravnica, because things are built on top of other things for like eons going back in time, there's all sorts of information and knowledge that's lost. So, like, for example, there are these beings called the Nephilim, who are these cosmic horror, eldritch horror style beings that a group called the Cult of Yore worship as their old gods. And no one really knows a ton about them, but the last time they showed up on Ravnica, they just decimated districts. And you can throw in a lot of very fun stuff on Ravnica, and anything in the, basically any 1920s era fiction, that we all enjoy, like noir, can fit in there.
Sure. Awesome.
one other thing I would want to mention about Ravnica is there's also a lot of other good potential stories out there. So, the book itself is entirely focused on the 10th district, which is essentially, I mean, it's Manhattan, but there's a whole, like, moon-sized world there, or Earth's moon-sized world there. And, you know, various factions might have set up bases outside of outside of public eye. In previous stories, for instance, there was a Izzet mage who found 2 eggs, like Niv-Mizzet, the most powerful dragon on the plane, who was the last of his kind. We'll talk about plot hooks with him a little bit later. Tried to revive those eggs. Or in other examples, there are, bases and science stations set up all across the plane. In some cases, there are outposts and kind of post-apocalyptic style rebuilding. You could have a Mad Max setting out in the rubble belt somewhere, where it's just destroyed civilization and people are trying to eke out a living. There's all sorts of cool stuff you can do.
And of course, you can check out all sorts of different hooks in the Guildmaster's Guide to Ravnica, the setting book, which was released by Wizards of the Coast, and find all sorts of information about the guilds, about ways where you can incorporate them into your stories, and it really is a great plane to tell stories on, or at least take elements for telling a type of 1920s era story, because a lot of us have built planes which are less hardcore high fantasy and go more towards the kind of 1800s, early 1900s level of technology, with the introduction of basic firearms and even a little bit of steampunk, which you see a lot in Ravnica with the Izzet League. You can find a lot of information from there, which can help you tell those kinds of stories in your own setting, even if you don't want to use something on Ravnica itself.
And there are a lot of magic cards set on Ravnica, because there's been 8 sets there, more than any plane except Dominaria, which is the one Magic spent like the first 10 years of its existence on. So, just go to a site like Scryfall, which has a lot of magic cards, and go to the sets, and you can just find all sorts of inspiration just by going through the cards.
Yeah. And the most recent time we were there with Ravnica Allegiance and Guilds of Ravnica, the artwork and the visual style that they incorporated for all the guilds is very distinctive and very flavorful, and gives a lot of inspiration for storytelling just by looking at the way that the characters are depicted. I especially like the Golgari and their mushroom motif. The Izzet is awesome with their crazy contraptions. There's lots of cool stuff that you can look at and learn. Transitioning over to the second Magic setting, which is Theros. This came out much more recently. This D&D book came out much more recently. The Mythic Odysseys of Theros. This is not 1920s. This is, as we've mentioned before, kind of Greek mythology world. It's very ancient Greek. Tell us a little bit about what makes Theros tick.
So Theros is a cool world in Magic's lore, because it has this element of the collective unconscious. So the gods of Theros mimic the Greek gods. They're all very clear analogs, although they have different domains. So, like, the Zeus equivalent is Heliod, god of the sun. They all reside in the starry domain of Nyx, where you can literally see the gods in their god realm in, like, the constellations of the night sky. And the night sky will act out pieces of myths and things from there. And we've learned from the metaphysics of the plane that a lot of that is derived from the collective unconscious of people. So years and years ago, when humanity first arrived on the plane or started to develop some civilization, they had fears, and these primal fears became what were called the Titans. And eventually those kinds of, as humanity developed and wasn't quite as afraid of fire or hurricanes or the weather or starvation, that evolved into the gods that we see today over time. And all of that is described in the book, but it's a very cool element because there's a dream and metaphysical question about how much of this is real. Like, the gods are the product of mortal belief, but are they also their own independent thing at this point? And so that's challenged in some of the stories.
That's a quite interesting concept in Dungeons and Dragons, because the way that just gods work in this setting is so different than in typical D&D stories. They're such a huge part of Theros, but they're so different than, just getting your powers from a patron far off on Mount Celestia like you do in Dungeons and Dragons, where you don't really have much interaction with your particular entity. The gods are such a huge part of every element of Theros society.
They're very hands-on, yeah. At least in the stories we see. To the common person, they're probably never going to see their god in person, but they can see their god in the night sky every night. Faith isn't really a question on Theros. It's, if you learn the truth, do you still believe in these gods? And that has been an ongoing issue in some of the stories, including the first major villain of a Theros block was a planeswalker who left the plane, saw that the gods didn't exist, didn't have any power over different planes, and came back and essentially launched a plot to make himself ascend into godhood to prove how false the rest of them were.
Speaking of Xenagos the Reveler, I believe there.
Yes.
An amazing character. There were a couple of good characters in the first trip to Theros. Ashiok is another excellent character that we honestly don't know that much about.
Yeah, Ashiok is a nightmare mage that does not use pronouns. We don't use pronouns for Ashiok. We just use Ashiok. And because of Ashiok's power over nightmares, and because of the plane's intimate connection to dreams and the collective unconscious, Ashiok went so far as to create like a proto-god just to see what would happen. And the proto-god named Cacophony ended up getting subsumed into one of the bigger gods. And some of the metaphysics there is it's implied that like new gods are created on a regular basis, and frequently like part of the reason the other gods have, multiple domains is because those concepts end up getting combined together in people's minds. So, Cacophony, who was a god of the city, gets combined with the main god of cities and god of civilization, Ithara, in the plane.
So whenever you think about the main players of this plane, there's obviously locations or different things like that is described. But really, most stories here are going to have something to do with the gods and their relationship to the plane itself and your characters, whether that's antagonistic or just agnostic in terms of just like I don't care, or whether or not you're a worshiper of one of the others. The gods really are the major player, right?
Oh yeah, definitely. And each of the cities called polises on the plane. Each of the cities has their own patron deity. They worship other deities, other of the gods, but they usually have one that's pretty central to them. So Melitus, which is the city of like enlightenment. It's meant to be the Athens of the plane. They worship Ithara, the god of the city. The Croans, they're essentially the Spartan analogs, and they worship the honorable god of war. While the Minotaur city, Minos. It's a plane of it's a city of Minotaur. So it's based around the labyrinth myth, and they worship the god of death and destruction and slaughter, who also happens to look like a Minotaur. And then there are the Amazonian analogs who worship the god of harvests and the gods of nature. And now they all worship other gods because it's, one of the problems, as one of my friends, Shivam Butt, usually puts it, Western fantasy tends to have defined polytheistic religions as a whole lot of monotheisms, whereas in reality, they, all these people have multiple gods they worship, even though in the RPG book, you're really encouraged to be a devotee of just a single god.
Yeah. It seems that way in Theros. You might say, okay, I worship Karametra most of all, but like I also worship, Nylea. I also worship, these other ones which are similar in some ways. Even if I might have one which has the place on the top shelf, I still have plenty of other shelves.
Yeah. And usually the book does a very good job of defining which gods get along, which would give you a good in-character knowledge of, which gods it's probably okay for you to be cool with and to pray to every once in a while and not make your god pretty angry by doing so, and which ones that if you do a favor for, you are just cast out.
Sure.
which can be part of the political intrigue there. And I mean, really, this plane is all about taking the coolest Greek myths and creating an analog for your characters. Like, how would you and your friends survive the Odyssey? How would you survive? How would you survive the Trojan War, which is called the Acroan War on? That one's pretty thinly veiled, but there are a lot of other myths there. There are a lot more Gorgons here if you want to fight or Medusas if you want to fight them. In Magic, we call them Gorgons.
We've mentioned a lot already about the different types of stories which have taken place on Theros. The different Greek story analogs, and then obviously the story to do with Xenagos and Ashiok, and just diving into just the true aspect of these gods and their relationship with the collective unconsciousness of the denizens of the plane.
And we should mention the gods don't necessarily know that they're a product of the collective unconscious. Really, there's just one that knows that, which is Krufix, the god of the horizons.
Interesting. I hadn't considered that. That's a really interesting point.
They think they're just gods. They think they are the way they've always been, which is factually not the case. So don't walk up to them and tell them, or you might find yourself smoked.
At best. Might be stuck to a rock and having your liver pecked out. We can call back to an actual Greek story with the punishment in that particular scenario.
Yep, Prometheus. And there's an analog for that, Chained to the Rocks.
Yes.
A magic card, yep. One more really cool thing about Theros I wanted to mention, besides the collective unconscious aspect, and that's the underworld. You can have a total party kill on Theros and not have your campaign end. Because the Theros underworld is a physical place where you can potentially get out of. Whether or not you get out with your identity intact is another issue. But if your party, if you're the DM and your party bites off more than they can chew, feel free to kill them, because they might find themselves waking up in the underworld and having to undergo a quest there to earn their way back out to the world of the living. Or maybe they need to find, an answer to a question in the campaign, and the only person who knows the answer is dead, and they have to find them in the underworld.
Yeah. That is a really awesome aspect. Broad stroke in terms of these two different magic planes. Again, we mentioned planeswalkers, and that's largely how a lot of the modern Magic story, especially since Magic Origins is kind of connected, is you are following the connected story of planeswalkers across these different realities. So you mentioned Jace, so we see him pop up in multiple different stories just as history passes across all these different realities, and he's just hopping back and forth between the different ones. There's not much about incorporating them into a Dungeons and Dragons story. They're just kind of just there as just like, yeah, these things exist in Magic. How would you incorporate them to telling our own story? Because that's something that's kind of been adjusted over time, where how planeswalkers are actually relating to the normal people in a Magic set, in a Magic story, where we have people like Rat, so to speak, back on Ravnica, just a normal person. And there's at times has been a disconnect, I think, between planeswalkers and just everyday normal people. And incorporating both together, which is what you kind of have to do in a D&D setting if you want a powerful planeswalker to come across your party, takes some doing. Is there a way that you find that they work best whenever you're trying to connect the two?
So what I would say about planeswalkers is that they are the ultimate plot device in one of these settings. So from a story perspective, planeswalkers are used to connect these disparate settings. In the past, they had like almost godlike power. In many cases, were worshipped like gods. We mentioned the Elder Dragon Nicol Bolas. He was worshipped as a god across the multiverse, and part of his plan was to get back that godlike power that he lost in an event called the Mending, which made all of the planeswalkers in the multiverse mortal again, essentially. They were more like regular wizards that could travel between worlds instead of these god beings that traveled between worlds. But what that means is you've got these characters that can literally just pop in and pop out whenever you need them. Planeswalkers in stories tend to be wrecking balls. So, if you need a hook to bring your characters together, use a planeswalker. Have them, maybe your characters don't know, your players don't know about planeswalkers, in character at least. You can use that planeswalker to drive the story. They keep popping up somewhere, giving cryptic hints just when the players happen to need it. So their ability to planeswalk in and out will really lend itself to keeping your players on track. And also their ability to planeswalk away helps if you've got a party of murderers who just want to kill this character you brought up. Yeah. But if your character, your players have like a favorite character, and there are some 40, 50 planeswalkers right now, not including all the old school ones that haven't gotten cards yet, you can incorporate them as well into the plot, and that will help keep them involved. I wouldn't recommend making your players planeswalkers, because that creates a whole set of challenges, especially.
Yes.
It's just a nightmare. People have been trying to do it forever, and it's not great. Unless you have one character who's a planeswalker and you give them the ability to drag everyone else alongside them, it's not really a lot of fun for all the other players, because splitting the party across dimensions is rough.
Yes.
But yeah, I would just use them as your ultimate plot device to keep the plot moving. If your planeswalkers are having trouble, just have a planeswalker show up. You don't need to worry about how they got there. They planeswalked in.
Sure.
And that's generally, they'll usually be a plot driver as well, because either they are causing an epic problem on a plane, they're trying to solve an epic problem on the plane, or they're causing an epic problem by trying to solve a problem. And it usually falls into the last category, especially for a lot of the older planeswalkers. For instance, in the set Zendikar Rising, a planeswalker named Nahiri is trying to solve this problem that has come up with the plane in more recent times, except her solution was going to be about as bad as the problem itself. And you can also give them, either they run the whole spectrum. So they can be characters who pop in who used to be gods and are still thinking from the mindset of someone who used to be a god, even though they're mortal and they don't really care about individuals. And they can be a really great villain, even if they are a hero in their own mind. Sometimes the old school Planeswalker heroes were much worse than many of the villains we see today.
Mm-hmm. Looking at you, Urza.
Yeah, that is the poster child for that. And there are just all sorts of ways you can incorporate them. Like, just the idea of a character that can pop in and pop out at will is really useful as a game master.
That's awesome. And I guess final question before we head out to the wilds: what other plane would you like to see for the next Magic D&D crossover, and why is it Fiora?
So I really love Fiora. Two of my favorite planeswalkers came from there. My Dak Faden, may he rest in peace, and
Yes.
Doretti, who is this goblin artificer planeswalker who you should all incorporate into your campaigns because he's great, even though he doesn't appear in very many stories. But honestly, Fiora is a plane from a setting called Conspiracy, which is the kind of city-based, it's like a Renaissance Italy plane where everyone is vying for control of this high city of Poliano. Honestly, like, you can do that in a lot of different settings. I think the plane I would really, two planes I would really want to see in the next setting, if I'm being super serious. The first is Dominaria, which is Magic's original setting, which actually has a map that was designed because it was meant to be part of an RPG that got canceled. So back in the 90s, there was supposed to be a Magic the Gathering RPG, and the map of Dominaria was designed to progress players through progressively harder areas. And I really just want a D&D setting there. It's a lot like Eberron, for people who are familiar with the plane of Eberron. That's why I like Eberron, the campaign setting. It's this mixture of low and high fantasy, low technology and high technology, ancient and new and modern, all coming together at once because Magic's design direction in the past was just completely chaotic. They're like, let's set everything on Dominaria. We want an ice plane? Let's make an ice age. We want an Africa plane? Well, here's the Africa continent, and everything that ran along the spectrum there. Whereas now they would typically separate those ideas out into different planes. The other would be Kaladesh, just because I am a huge fan of the plane in general. It is a very upbeat plane, where they use the term aetherpunk, but it's a steampunk India plane. I love it in part because my wife's Indian, and I just I also love artifacts in the game. And the plane was initially introduced as a red-blue setting, for those of you who know what that means. And I love all the red-blue stuff. So it just seems like a cool place to go on an adventure. You'd have a party of 4 artificers. Like, if you want to have that kind of party, Kaladesh would be a great place to go.
Awesome. Well, I think that will about wrap up our discussion on Ravnica and Theros. Let's head out into the wilds and talk a little bit about a giant dragon. We're out here in the wilderness. Well, I guess not so much the wilderness. We're back in the 10th district in the city, and we're looking at Niv-Mizzet, the Firemind. As you mentioned, he's the guild leader and always has been of the Izzet League.
Yeah, the Izzet League is this group of mad scientist inventors who, like I said, are as liable to blow something up as to create anything useful. Frequently, their inventions get repurposed. They intend it for one thing. It doesn't do that thing, sometimes fatally so, but they do find another good use for it. So they're very crafty. They're not really big on safety regulations. And they're my kind of people. They're just chaotic. If you got to describe them in D&D terms, they are chaotic neutral artificer wizards to the extreme.
Yes, yes. And chaotic neutral is the alignment of Niv-Mizzet, the most powerful creature in Guildmaster's Guide to Ravnica, and one of the most powerful in all of 5th edition at a challenge rating of 26. He's basically just as powerful as an ancient red dragon with the ability to also cast tons of spells all the way up to 9th level. As the head of this crazy, mad science innovation league, while he's very ambitious and loves to discover and innovate, he's not dumb, and he's, for my money, I think he might be the most intelligent creature in all of the Magic multiverse. I don't know, what are your opinions on that statement?
He's close. I won't say the most intelligent, but he is very, very close. Of non-Planeswalker characters, I don't think we've encountered a more brilliant individual.
So tell us a little bit about him.
So Niv is a little over 15,000 years old. In Magic parlance, he's not what's called an elder dragon, which is sort of has this metaphysical quality, where Nicol Bolas and Ugin, who we've mentioned, are these planeswalker dragons who are elder dragons, and that just in general for them means they were spawned by a being called the Dragon, who is the embodiment of dragonkind. They are like the ultimate dragons. Niv-Mizzet isn't quite there, but he's the last of his kind on Ravnica. He's brilliant, and the thought of there being more like him is an apocalypse level event for Ravnica. So I mentioned a little bit more of one of the plots of the second book in the original Ravnica series, details this mad Izzet mage who is out in the boonies, in the rubble belt, and he has discovered Niv-Mizzet's old nesting ground, and he discovered 2 dragon eggs, or 3 dragon eggs, just like Niv-Mizzet's, that he's trying to hatch, and he's going to gain control of, and basically dominate the entire plane with these 3 dragons, because he could if they had that many dragons at Niv-Mizzet's level at his disposal. He, like I said, he's the last of his kind. He's not the last dragon, but he's the last of the intelligent dragons on Ravnica. He founded about 10,000 years ago the Izzet League, and he's been pretty comfortable to lead it ever since, although he has tried, like all of the various guilds, to gain more power over time. He ultimately succeeded. So one thing I should note about the Guildmaster's Guide to Ravnica is it takes place just before War of the Spark, where there were some shakeups with guild leadership. He became the living guild pact himself after that. So you can have him as either in your campaigns. You can have him as the super powerful leader of the Izzet Guild, or you can have him as this chaotic neutral dragon who's the arbiter of law on this massive city plane. Both of which are pretty intimidating characters.
Absolutely.
Who will probably be up to something. He's nicknamed the Firemind because of his genius, essentially. But also, magically, he can share some of his brilliance with his most trusted wizard advisors. And they can access the Firemind, which makes them smarter. And basically, he's just like, his brain is like just a ton of networked computers running in parallel. So he can be going through multiple different problems all at the same time. He does these orders that sound like completely unrelated. But in his mind, he knows how they all fit together. But in general, it'll just sound like he's ordering random pointless stuff to be experimented on or done.
And he's a very interesting person to me to be a background character in a campaign as just a leader in the setting where the players are, because he can go both ways in terms of being a helper or an antagonist to a party. He's not evil, but he's extremely ambitious, and he's always looking to discover more, and he'll do a lot of things in order to try to accomplish that goal. So he can end up on the player's good or bad side, and all the players can do the same for him in several different ways.
Yeah, he does not appreciate it when you get in the way of his plans, and he is not above eating people, although he hasn't really done it in a long time. And you would, while he is not as powerful as, say, Nicol Bolas, because he lost badly to Nicol Bolas, he is nothing to be trifled with. He's one of the most powerful beings on the plane, in addition to being the founder of one of the 10 guilds. Not all 10 guilds were founded by some all-powerful entity, but the Izzet certainly were, or come really close with this dragon.
Sure.
So players should rightfully be afraid of this character, and not just because he's level 26. I didn't realize he was a CR 26. I wasn't looking at his challenge rating, but yikes.
Yeah,
I would not want to face him down.
He's quite literally more powerful than any monster manual creature other than the Tarask. And it makes sense, because, like I said, he's just as powerful, if not more so, than an ancient red dragon with his massive breath attack, his legendary actions, his tail, and claw attacks. But then he's got all the way up to 9th level spells, and he has the ability to be able to concentrate on 2 different spells at once, and he's just an incredibly powerful entity. I think he'd be a great person just to throw in any setting that was an early technology setting like this. I think it would just work great to have the leader of a faction be this extremely powerful, extremely intelligent dragon. I think that would be an excellent thing to tell stories with, and I could see that going in many different directions depending on the party's actions in the campaign.
Yeah. So Niv, you could really, as the person running the campaign, you can really go in a lot of different directions with him. It's very easy to get on his good side or bad side, or just be a tool that he uses and intends to throw away. Or even be, frankly, you could have Niv-Mizzet as a patron. Niv can be good flavor for some of the existing patrons that are out there, or just create your own for him as his gift of the Firemind to you, one of the Izzet wizards.
Sure. With his current status, if you did want to play in Ravnica, where he's actually the living guild pack instead of Jace Beleren, what kind of things does that change about him than just being the kind of up on his tower experimental lord over the Izzet?
So part of it is he is no longer partisan to the Izzet. I mean, he might be in his heart. You know, he created them. But he's responsible for all of the guilds now, and his style does not mesh well with all of the others. So we haven't seen much of this because, not until we see Ravnica again are we really going to get more of a glimpse of his role as the actual living guild pact. What I would say is that his style does not mesh well with a lot of the guilds, and I imagine they're going to miss the somewhat absentee living guild pact in Jace Beleren, who is off rescuing other planes and not doing his job on Ravnica on a regular basis. They might miss that when he is doing all sorts of weird stuff that they don't understand how it connects to one another. It's also going to be much more difficult to pull one over on Niv. He's brilliant, and he's not the type to easily fall for anything. So seeing him play around with legalese in the way that some of the other characters in the past have tried to get one over on Jace, because Jace doesn't actually understand what they were trying to tell him. That could be an interesting way to go. Niv-Mizzet, as well as the Guardian of the Guild Pact, also it creates an interesting plot device in if your characters are doing something that might disrupt the Guild Pact or disrupt Guild Pact harmony, you might find Niv-Mizzet flying over the horizon to stop them. Or maybe he's their boss and he's giving them direction, and they are very confused by these seemingly random missions that they're sent out to do until you reveal the true purpose of them later. So you can use them for a lot of things as an antagonist or as a like a group patron.
Yeah. What better thing to have than being able to roleplay as a maniacal wizard as a DM than having that maniacal wizard be an all-powerful dragon? So, best of both worlds.
And one of your plot hooks might be, okay, how do we get rid of this living guild pact? What magics can we do to disrupt this? How can we put a check on his power now that this ancient maniacal dragon has finally gained the ultimate power on the plane?
Interesting.
And it should be clear, Living Guild Pact is not like the king of Ravnica. It is it's the United Nations of Ravnica. It is not it's not the president of Ravnica. It's like an arbiter that makes everyone play by the rules that everyone agreed to. Mm-hmm. But it's still the most powerful position on the plane.
Well, I think that's about enough time out here in the wilderness. Let's head over to the tavern and get some refreshment. All right, out here in the tavern. Today's plot hook: what would you do if you met the Wanderer? Now, the Wanderer is a planeswalker in Magic the Gathering lore, and we don't honestly know too much about her. We first saw her in War of the Spark, which we've referenced a couple of times. We saw her in the books that were written surrounding that storyline as well. We saw her help out Ral in some of his missions, Ral Zarek, the Planeswalker. But we don't know too much about her. But she's interesting as a Planeswalker because instead of having to expend effort in order to jump between realities, in order to have to exert effort in order to planeswalk, it takes effort for her to not planeswalk.
Yeah, she is fascinating even to me because I mean, honestly, when I was first reading about her character, I was like, did you all make a typo? What do you mean it takes effort for her not to planeswalk? But as time goes, I found that really interesting. She is the ultimate archetype in Magic because, a lot of things in Magic are analogs of other fiction, other character archetypes. The Wanderer is literally named the Wanderer. She is the Mifune in Yojimbo. She is, in the Western adaptation of that, she is Clint Eastwood in A Fistful of Dollars. She is the Wanderer character who shows up in town, tries to do a good thing, and doesn't stick around. And that's really interesting. We had her show up randomly on Ikoria on one card, just slicing a monster in half. Didn't appear in the story. Didn't factor into anything else, but the idea that she's just popping up places, helping as she can while she's there until, she falls asleep, she wakes up on another plane, she gets knocked unconscious, she disappears and shows up on another world. So the idea that she has to take effort to remain on one plane is very interesting. It's got to be useful. I mentioned before that planeswalkers are the ultimate plot device. The Wanderer, in that regard, is also a really cool plot device because she can be used in ways that the other planeswalkers can't really. Other planeswalkers, they get knocked unconscious. They're unconscious on the ground there, but as a GM, you have the ability with the Wanderer to give a powerful ally to your characters and then take her away without her betraying them, running away, or anything like that, or killing her off. And you can just bring her back whenever. More so than the others, that's interesting to me, because if I know my characters or my players are going to be in trouble, I can give them the Wanderer, and then maybe... let's not do this too much so that she is always comically getting knocked out and run off the plane.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But, maybe her concentration is broken, or she's hit by a spell that disrupts her ability to concentrate. The thought on it might be that she has to maintain, like, she has this fictional spell in the game where she has to maintain concentration on it, and anything that breaks that makes her vanish. And she has to take time to catch back up to the players. And so that really creates interesting scenarios in the game, I think. She's also really cool. She's got like this whip sword that she flings around. We haven't seen her face. She's got a cool hat, a cool outfit. She's just a cool character. Like, I want to know more about her, but at the same time, I don't want to know any more about her, because knowing more about these kinds of characters like ruins the mystique of ththese characters.
Yeah, kind of like the thing of like I want to see Master Chief's face, and you're like, no, we don't. So it's
well, it's like Boba Fett. It's like look at like Boba Fett. Boba Fett got less cool the more we learned about Boba Fett. Like when Boba Fett was this mysterious, masked character who, like, all these other people relied on, people were like, whoa. And then Boba Fett is kind of a whiny kid whose dad gets killed and then goes on some silly adventures with other, as like a 10-year-old with a bunch of bounty hunters in the Clone Wars. And it's every time we see more of Boba Fett, it's kind of like I kind of wish he was just a mysterious guy in a mask. And the show The Mandalorian kind of takes that to an extreme by introducing a new Mandalorian who does not remove the helmet, and you don't really learn much more about them. Sure. And you don't really need to. You just know their code. It's that kind of character. So as much as I want to learn more, at the same time, I really don't. I just want, for a few years, I want a few years of time where the Wanderer shows up on planes, does something random, isn't really a part of the story, and disappears. And we're just like teased about her until they inevitably reveal something more.
I like the idea of using her as a way of actually introducing planeswalkers into your story. Because if your party has no idea that planeswalkers exist, and then they interact with this really powerful NPC in the Wanderer, who's really mysterious and not giving their name, and all of a sudden they see this character get knocked unconscious, or see them fall asleep and vanish from thin air, and now all of a sudden they have this mystery that they try to figure out and solve, and then they meet up with this character again, and it's an interesting way to introduce that concept of a realm traveler to a party through just a unique, powerful NPC that they happen to encounter.
Yeah, and maybe they can find a way to contact her when she's off plane, maybe a spell or something, and get her aid later, or have her show up, kind of like a miracle or something like that, where they where they try and contact her, they're not sure it works. It looks like they bit off more than they can chew, and then the Wanderer shows up and helps them. I'm thinking a little bit like, do you know the Fallout games, the mysterious stranger who just kind of show, like, if you're lucky enough, will just show up and like do a critical hit on an enemy for you.
Interesting.
I'm thinking that kind of an idea for an encounter. Turns out they're probably not going to do too great. Maybe the Wanderer shows up and helps.
Awesome. Yeah, really interesting character. And if you're going to take some inspiration from magic, then that is one place to start, as is all of the rest of everything that we've discussed today. Obviously, lots more that we could cover. But this hopefully serves as a good introduction to Ravnica and Theros and just magic lore in general, and ways that we can take inspiration from it for Dungeons and Dragons. But I think that'll about wrap up today's show. Thank you very much for joining me, Jay.
Thank you for having me on. If you all liked hearing about magic lore, check out my podcast where I'm a co-host called The Vorthos Cast. We are on pretty much, we're on Twitter, Tumblr. Our podcast should be on pretty much any podcast service. We've had 2 years of people complaining why we're not on their favorite, so we should hopefully show up. If you are interested in my writing, you can find me at coolstuffinc.com, including where I have a couple articles on where to find more world-building lore and background lore if you are a D&D fan looking into magic settings. Also please buy my book, Legends of Visual History. It is not something I'm going to make more profit off of when more of them sell, because it was a work for hire. But if it sells well, they'll hire me to make more, and I would like to make more.
Well, we hope you get the chance to. But thank you again for joining us, and thank you all out there for listening. Be sure to check out our Patreon, check out Oath of Destiny, check out Jay and the Vorthos Cast, and all of the things that they take part in. And again, thanks very much for listening from all of us here at the Plot Hooks team. I'm Samuel. Thanks from Matt, Mike, Becca, Steve, Dave, Zach, and of course, podcast Pupper Ellie. We'll see you all next week for another episode of Plot Hooks.